Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the terrifying Vaughn Manor, where, that's right, Roger, it's almost time for the mayhem to begin again. Yes, horror mayhem. Horror mayhem. A great booktube event created by the Bookish Bryants that celebrates horror fiction. Now, horror mayhem is interesting. It celebrates horror fiction, and it's a month where we read horror fiction, but it focuses on horror fiction that is on the shorter side, 250 pages or less for a novel, or a short story, or novelette, or whatever. This works really well for horror because a lot of the classics of horror tend to be on the shorter side. So that's cool. And everybody had a great time doing Horror Mayhem last year. And so we're all really looking forward to Horror Mayhem this year. The Bookish Bryants, who created Horror Mayhem, seem to have disappeared, unfortunately. Now, the rumor is, and Roger has this on great authority, that the Bookish Bryants were kidnapped by aliens and transported to another world, and so have been unable to make videos. Now, actually, what probably happened is that real life conspired against them and has prevented them from making videos lately. Now, real life is something that I advise you to avoid at all costs. Real life, man, it's nothing but trouble. So avoid real life if you can, because it'll do stuff like that. Keep you from making videos. So we're a couple weeks away from Horror Mayhem. Now, last year, Horror Mayhem was divided into themes for the week. It's a little too late for that now, because if you're anything like me, you've got to think ahead of time about what you're going to read. And so it's literally going to be mayhem this year, and that is just, just read horror. As far as I know, that's how it's going to be. Now, you know how it is. Great booktube events are like great booktube tags. They live on even after the creators have, for whatever reason, stopped making videos. And Horror Mayhem was a great booktube event, and we all had a great time with it. And we've all been looking forward to it, so, we're all going to do it. Horror Mayhem, it's coming. Now, like I said, 250 pages or less, but my first book is a total cheat. I'm totally cheating with the first book I'm going to be reading for Horror Mayhem. Because it's this book. It's Pet Sematary by Stephen King. I'm doing my read every book by Stephen King challenge that I've been doing for as long as I've been on BookTube, basically. But I took like 6 months off or something from reading Stephen King. Not deliberately, it just sort of turned out that way. So now I've got to catch up. So in May, for Horror Mayhem, I'm reading 2 Stephen King books. And this is the next one on my list. And yes, it's over 250 pages. In fact, it's almost 400 pages. But I'm going to read it anyway. Now, I've read this before, and I remember it being totally great. In fact, I consider it probably the greatest horror novel ever written because it just works so well as a horror novel. Now, horror novels, they can be something that are difficult to pull off. Horror is something that seems to work better in short stories on average, but you can write brilliant horror novels because, they've been done over and over again. And this one in particular, I think is fantastic. Haven't read this since I don't remember the last time I read it, but it's been a couple decades, I think. So yeah, Pet Sematary by Stephen King. Looking forward to this one. This is going to be the first thing I read for Horror Mayhem. But I'm following that up with the next Stephen King book on the list, which does totally qualify for Horror Mayhem because it's short, and that's The Cycle of the Werewolf by Stephen King. This is only 127 pages long, 127 pages. Has illustrations by the great Bernie Wrightson. Let's see if I could find one of the great illustrations by Bernie Wrightson. Here we go. This is a werewolf eating somebody on top of a truck. Now, this is something that could happen if you're driving a truck in an area where there are werewolves. It's kind of an occupational hazard. So, yeah, it's grim, and this book is full of great illustrations like that. This is a book I read when it came out. So it's been a while. This was what, 1984 or 5? Let me see if I could find when this was published the first time. Let's see. 1983. Came out in 1983. So it's been a while. I was, what, 12? I was 12 when this came out. So I actually probably read this a year or two after it came out, because I had to have been like 13 or 14 when I read this. Cycle of the Werewolf by Stephen King. So these two Stephen King books are going to take probably a couple weeks. But that leaves me with a couple weeks left where I can concentrate on short stories. So I've got 5 volumes to choose from. And the first one I'm thinking I probably am going to read. The first one is a collection. The first one is an anthology. It's an anthology called A Century of Horror, 1970 to 1979. The Greatest Stories of the Decade, edited by David Drake. So this publisher, this was published by MJF Books back in 96? Let's see if my memory is correct. Yeah, 1996. So this series of books, well, this was part of a line of books. There was going to be a century of horror, a century of science fiction, a century of fantasy, and a century of mystery. And they were going to be a whole series of anthologies on all of those subjects. And they were all going to be anthologies showcasing stories from the 20th century. Unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, they only produced this one from the horror line. This was the only book from the horror line, A Century of Horror from the 1970s. And they did a science fiction volume, which I think was from the 1950s. I think. I could be wrong, but I think it was the 1950s. And I believe that's it. I don't think they ever did a mystery volume. I don't know that they ever did a fantasy volume. Let me know if you know if I'm wrong. But I've certainly never seen them. But I have seen this one around a lot. And I've seen the science fiction volume around a lot. This seems to be an excellent anthology. Kind of makes me wish they had done the rest of them, because it would have been an amazing set of horror short story collections. So this has a bunch of great stuff in it. This has Duel by Richard Matheson. It has The Events at Peroth Farm by T.E.D. Klein. Legendary horror writer T.E.D. Klein. Has Come Dance With Me on My Pony's Grave by Charles L. Grant. He was a good horror writer. Something Had to Be Done by David Drake. This volume has Styx by Carl Edward Wagner. Has Belson Express by Fritz Leiber. Ladies in Waiting by Hugh B. Cave, the great pulp writer Hugh B. Cave. Also has a bunch of other stuff. A Case of the Stubborns by Robert Bloch. It Only Comes Out at Night by Dennis Etchison. Has The Viaduct by Brian Lumley. Nightside by Joyce Carol Oates. Man, this has a bunch of stuff. The Man Who Was Heavily Into Revenge by Harlan Ellison. So a bunch of great stories and a bunch of others. So I'm thinking this has got to be a definite one for one of the books I read in May. Because this looks like an excellent volume. I've had this for a while, so it's about time I read it. But that leaves me with, at least another week after that, maybe more, depending on how fast I can get through these. And there's a few different books I want to read, including this great book that was published by Arkham House. This is Alone with the Horrors by Ramsey Campbell. Alone with the Horrors. Has some great photo montage artwork on it. Who does the artwork for this volume? J.K. Potter does the photo montage artwork. So yeah, his greatest short stories from, 1961 to 1991. So we have a really cool volume from legendary publisher Arkham House with that great artwork. Has a bunch of his famous stories, his more famous stories, a lot of stories. This is a good-sized volume, 500 pages from Arkham House. They did some just amazing books, Arkham House did. And yeah, I'm leaning pretty heavily on this one. But then there's also this one from Robert Bloch. This is Flowers from the Moon and Other Lunacies, another Arkham House book. Robert Bloch, famously, he was the author of Psycho, which became a very famous motion picture. He is an author I should talk more about on this channel. I'm kind of surprised I haven't talked more about Robert Bloch. I'm not quite sure why that is. He looks exactly like you would expect him to look, Robert Bloch. And he wrote some dynamite short stories and novels. This collection from Arkham House has his earliest stuff in it. This has a bunch of his short stories from Weird Tales and also Strange Stories. So his early pulp magazine stories are in here. And of course it's got more werewolves, you know, eating folks under the full moon, as werewolves do, you know. Dangerous Company, werewolves. Flowers from the Moon and Other Lunacies. This, another book I really, really want to read. But wait, I really, really want to read this one too. This is Brian Lumley's The Whisperer and Other Voices. I picked this up, God, is it about a year ago now, maybe? That I picked this book up at Dark Carnival in Berkeley. Dark Carnival, great science fiction and mystery bookshop in Berkeley. Have a bunch of horror there as well, and I picked this one up. Brian Lumley, of course, is famous for his Necroscope books, a series of books I like an awful lot. But this is a collection of his shorter work that I have not read and kind of want to. Has a great cover, as you would expect from these older books from Brian Lumley. Then we have this one from Robert W. Chambers. Criminali has mentioned this recently because he read this recently. This is The King in Yellow. But this edition doesn't just have the stories from A King in Yellow, the horror stories from A King in Yellow. It is The King in Yellow and other horror stories. So a bunch of other horror stories that Robert W. Chambers wrote. And this is the Dover edition, which has a great bunch of stories in here. And this dreadful cover that looks like there are some people peeing on this pile of books. That's all I see when I see this cover is, you know, books being peed on. Unfortunately, once you have that image in your mind, you can never unsee it, sadly. So, but I do want to read it because it looks to be excellent. And last but not least, definitely not least, is this collection of stories, The Best Supernatural Tales of Arthur Conan Doyle. Of course, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is the creator of Sherlock Holmes, one of my favorite characters of all time, and these are some of my favorite books of all time. But he also wrote a bunch of other stuff, including horror and supernatural stories, which is something you'll find in this. Another Dover book. This cover is a bit better than the other cover. It is on point as far as theme is concerned. So yeah, The Best Supernatural Tales of Arthur Conan Doyle. Another book I really want to read. Of course, I don't have time to read all of these books. I wish May would just go on for like 2 months so I could read all the books I want to in May. But it can't go on forever because June on the Range follows, which is something I will be making a video about in the very near future, actually, just to remind everybody about that. But Horror Mayhem is almost here. It's just a couple weeks away. Woohoo! I'm actually really looking forward to it. You know what? Whatever happens in life, I will always be doing Horror Mayhem, I think. I think May is always, for me, going to be the month when I focus on horror. It will always be Horror Mayhem at Stately Vaughan Manor. Okay, my friends, I will catch you next time.